The aroma of freshly baked apple pie wafted through the grand kitchen of Hawthorne Manor. Dorothy, her silver hair neatly tucked under a hairnet, pulled the golden brown masterpiece from the oven. She inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. At 68, her hands were gnarled from years of cooking, but they moved with practiced grace as she set the pie on the cooling rack. The kitchen door swung open with a bang. Richard Hawthorne, tech mogul and owner of the sprawling estate, stormed in. His tailored suit seemed at odds with the homey kitchen. "Dorothy, what's that smell? Didn't I tell you to stop with these outdated recipes?" Richard's voice was sharp, his eyes narrowed. Dorothy's shoulders tensed, but her voice remained steady. "It's apple pie, Mr. Hawthorne. Your daughter Emily requested it for her visit today." Richard scoffed. "Emily needs to watch her figure, and you need to get with the times. I've hired a new chef, someone who understands modern cuisine. He starts next week." The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "I see," she managed to say. "You can stay on to help, of course," Richard added, his tone dismissive. "Someone needs to do the dishes." As he turned to leave, his sleeve caught the edge of the cooling rack. The apple pie teetered for a moment before crashing to the floor, filling the air with the scent of wasted effort. Richard didn't even pause. "Clean that up," he called over his shoulder as he left. Dorothy stared at the ruined pie, fighting back tears. After decades of service, this was how she was treated. She grabbed a broom and began sweeping up the mess, her movements mechanical. The kitchen door creaked open again, more gently this time. Emily Hawthorne, a kinder version of her father, stepped in. Her eyes widened at the scene. "Oh, Dorothy, what happened to you?" She rushed to help, grabbing a dustpan. "Just an accident, Miss Emily," Dorothy said, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." Emily frowned, unconvinced. "Did Dad come through here?" I heard his voice. Dorothy hesitated, then nodded. "He had some news. There's going to be a new chef starting next week." "What?" "But you've been here forever. Your food is amazing." Emily's voice rose in indignation. "Times change, Miss Emily. Your father wants something more modern." Dorothy's voice caught on the last word. Emily shook her head. "This isn't right. I'll talk to him." "Please don't," Dorothy said quickly. "I don't want to cause any trouble. I'm grateful for the work I still have." Emily looked like she wanted to argue, but instead, she helped Dorothy finish cleaning up the pie. As they worked, Dorothy's eyes drifted to the window where her herb garden was visible. The small plot of land filled with carefully tended plants was her sanctuary. "At least I still have my garden," she murmured. Emily followed her gaze. "Your herbs. Dad's always complaining about that garden, says it's a waste of space." Dorothy's lips tightened. "Maybe to him. But those plants have been in my family for generations. There's more knowledge in those leaves than in all your father's computers." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Really? Like what?" For a moment, Dorothy's eyes lit up. She opened her mouth to explain, then caught herself. "Oh, it's just old folk remedies. Nothing that would interest your father or his new chef." Before Emily could press further, the intercom buzzed. Richard's voice filled the kitchen. "Emily, where are you? The board members are waiting." Emily sighed. "I have to go. But this conversation isn't over, Dorothy. Your apple pie is the best in the world, and I won't let Dad forget it." As Emily left, Dorothy turned back to her ruined kitchen. The mess was cleaned up, but the sting of Richard's words lingered. She walked to the window, placing her hand on the glass as she looked out at her beloved herb garden. "Well, old friends," she whispered to the plants, "looks like you might be all I have left soon." Little did Dorothy know that her garden, and the knowledge passed down through generations, would soon become more valuable than she could imagine. As the sun set over Hawthorne Manor, casting long shadows across the herb garden, the stage was set for an unexpected turn of events that would shake the very foundations of Richard Hawthorne's tech empire. In the coming days, Dorothy's world would be turned upside down. Her skills, so long overlooked, would be put to the ultimate test, and in the process, she would discover a strength she never knew she possessed. The kitchen fell silent as darkness crept in. Dorothy's hand still rested on the window, her reflection overlaying the garden outside. In that moment of quiet, a seed of change had been planted, one that would grow into something none of them could have predicted. "Now what?" Dorothy murmured to herself. "Now," came Emily's voice from the doorway, making Dorothy jump. "We fight back." Dorothy turned, surprised to see Emily still there. "Miss Emily, I thought you left for the meeting." Emily stepped into the kitchen, a determined look on her face. "Some things are more important than meetings. Tell me more about your herbs, Dorothy. I want to know everything." Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, her eyes fixed on Dorothy. "So, these herbs of yours, they're more than just seasonings, aren't they?" Dorothy hesitated, then nodded slowly. "They are, Miss Emily. Each plant has its own story, its own purpose beyond flavoring food." As Dorothy began to explain, the scene shifted to the following week. The kitchen buzzed with activity as the new chef, Marco, took charge. He was young, confident, and full of ideas that clashed with Dorothy's traditional methods. "No, no, no," Marco exclaimed, waving his hands dramatically. "We don't need these weeds." He gestured dismissively at Dorothy's carefully dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. Dorothy bit her tongue, focusing on chopping vegetables. Her role had been reduced to that of a kitchen assistant, and she was determined to keep her job, no matter how much it hurt her pride. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the dining room. Richard's angry voice carried through the doors. "What do you mean you can't come? This dinner is crucial for the launch of our new tech." The kitchen staff exchanged worried glances. Richard stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "Marco, the governor and his wife were supposed to be our guests of honor tonight, but they've canceled. Some sort of stomach bug. I need you to make this dinner unforgettable for the remaining guests." Marco puffed out his chest. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. I have just the menu in mind. Molecular gastronomy with a twist of—" Richard waved him off. "Just make it impressive." His eyes landed on Dorothy, and his frown deepened. "Why are you still hanging those weeds? I thought I made it clear we're modernizing." Before Dorothy could respond, Emily entered the kitchen. "Dad, leave her alone. Those herbs are part of what makes this house special." Richard rolled his eyes. "Special doesn't pay the bills, Emily. Innovation does." He turned on his heel and left, with Marco hurrying after him, rattling off ideas for the dinner. Emily approached Dorothy, who was quietly removing her dried herbs. "Don't take them down," Emily said softly. "Dad's just stressed about this dinner. Tell me more about these herbs. You mentioned something about stomach ailments last week." Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Yes, Miss Emily, this one here," she pointed to a bunch of dried peppermint, "is excellent for soothing upset stomachs. And this ginger root can help with nausea." Emily's eyes widened. "Really? Could you make something for the governor and his wife? If we could get them here, it would mean the world to Dad." Dorothy hesitated. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Miss Emily. Your father wouldn't approve. But if it works, he'd have to see how valuable your knowledge is," Emily pleaded. Before Dorothy could respond, Marco's voice cut through their conversation. "Emily, I need your opinion on the amuse-bouche." As Emily reluctantly left, Dorothy stood alone in the corner of the kitchen, conflict etched on her face. She glanced at her herbs, then at the bustling kitchen staff preparing for the important dinner. Making a decision, she slipped out the back door and headed to her garden. The sun was setting as Dorothy carefully selected leaves and roots from her plants. With practiced hands, she created a soothing tea blend. Sneaking back into the kitchen, she brewed the tea and poured it into a thermos. "Emily," she called softly, catching the young woman's attention, "if you can get this to the governor and his wife, it might help. But please, don't tell your father it came from me." Emily's face lit up. She took the thermos and hurried out, leaving Dorothy to return to her menial tasks, hoping she hadn't overstepped. Hours passed. The dinner was in full swing, with Marco's elaborate creations earning oohs and ahs from the guests. Dorothy watched from the sidelines, feeling more out of place than ever. Suddenly, the kitchen doors burst open. Richard strode in, his face a mix of emotions. "The governor and his wife are here," he announced. "Whatever was in that tea worked wonders. Emily, you're a genius." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, Dad, it wasn't me. It was—" But Richard wasn't listening. He was already back out the door, greeting his important guests. Emily caught Dorothy's eye and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Dorothy managed a small smile in return. As the night wore on, Dorothy couldn't help but feel a glimmer of pride. Her knowledge, passed down through generations, had saved the day. But as she watched Marco bask in the praise for his innovative menu, she wondered if anyone would ever truly appreciate the wisdom she carried. Little did she know, this small victory was just the beginning. A storm was brewing on the horizon, one that would test her skills in ways she could never have imagined. The dinner party finally wound down in the early hours of the morning. As the last guest left, Richard's triumphant voice echoed through the halls. "Emily, that tea of yours was a game changer. The governor couldn't stop raving about it." Emily's reply was muffled, but Dorothy, cleaning up in the kitchen, could sense the tension in her voice. She braced herself, knowing the truth would come out soon. The kitchen door swung open, and Richard entered, followed closely by Emily. His face was flushed with excitement, but it quickly changed as he saw Dorothy. "You're still here?" he asked, surprised. Then, turning to Emily, "What were you saying about the tea?" Emily took a deep breath. "Dad, it wasn't my tea, it was Dorothy's. She made it from her herbs." Richard's expression darkened. "What? You mean those weeds she insists on keeping?" Dorothy straightened her back, ready to face whatever came next. She hadn't expected recognition, but she also hadn't expected the anger she saw building in Richard's eyes. "Mr. Hawthorne," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I only wanted to help." Richard cut her off. "Help? By going behind my back? By undermining the new direction of this household?" Emily stepped between them. "Dad, stop. Dorothy's knowledge saved your dinner, saved your deal with the governor." The kitchen fell silent, the tension palpable. Richard's gaze darted between Dorothy and Emily, his jaw clenched. Finally he spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "We'll discuss this in the morning, all of us." As he turned to leave, he swayed slightly, catching himself on the counter. Emily reached out to steady him, concern etched on her face. "Dad, are you okay?" Richard waved her off. "Just tired. It's been a long night." But as he walked away, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She'd seen that kind of unsteadiness before, in her years of caring for the Hawthorne family. It wasn't just fatigue. As the kitchen door swung shut behind Richard, Emily turned to Dorothy, her eyes wide with worry. "Dorothy," she whispered, "I've never seen Dad like this. Do you think—" Dorothy patted Emily's hand reassuringly. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Miss Emily. Your father's had a stressful night. Some rest will do him good." But even as she spoke the words, Dorothy couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. Something was wrong, and she had a sinking suspicion that her herbs might be needed again soon, for a far more serious situation than an upset stomach. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the kitchen windows as Emily and Dorothy stood there, both lost in thought. The challenges of the night had been overcome, but it felt like the calm before a storm. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dorothy squeezed her hand. "We wait, Miss Emily, and we prepare." The next morning arrived with an uneasy calm settling over Hawthorne Manor. Dorothy was already in the kitchen preparing a light breakfast when Emily burst through the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Dorothy, it's Dad. He's not well." Dorothy set down the bowl she was holding. "What's wrong, Miss Emily?" "He's burning up with fever. He can barely stand. The doctor is on his way, but—" Emily's voice trailed off, her hands twisting anxiously. Without a word, Dorothy hurried to her herb cabinet. She grabbed several jars, her movements quick and sure. "I'll make him a tea. It won't cure him, but it might help ease his symptoms until the doctor arrives." As Dorothy worked, Marco entered the kitchen, looking confused. "What's going on? Mr. Hawthorne's meeting with the board has been canceled." Emily explained the situation briefly. Marco's face paled. "But the launch of the new tech line is next week. Mr. Hawthorne can't be sick now." Dorothy ignored the chatter, focusing on brewing her herbal blend. She could feel Emily's eyes on her, watching every move with a mixture of hope and desperation. Just as Dorothy finished pouring the tea into a cup, the sound of sirens pierced the morning quiet. Emily rushed to the window. "It's an ambulance. Oh God, it must be worse than we thought." The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics rushed Richard to the hospital, with Emily following close behind. Dorothy was left in the empty kitchen, her cooling tea untouched on the counter. Marco paced nervously. "This is a disaster. Without Mr. Hawthorne, the whole launch could fall apart." Dorothy shot him a sharp look. "A man's health is at stake, and you're worried about a product launch?" Marco had the grace to look ashamed. "You're right. I'm sorry. This job means everything to me." Dorothy's expression softened. "I understand, but right now, we need to focus on helping Mr. Hawthorne recover." As the day wore on, news trickled in from the hospital. Richard's condition was serious but stable. The doctors were running tests, but they seemed puzzled by his symptoms. Emily returned late that evening, exhausted and worried. "The doctors can't figure out what's wrong with him," she told Dorothy. "They're talking about rare toxins, running all sorts of tests. But Dad's getting worse, and they don't know why." Dorothy frowned. "Toxins? That's unusual. Has your father been anywhere strange lately? Eaten anything out of the ordinary?" Emily shook her head. "No, nothing like that. He's barely left the house lately, too busy with work." She paused, then added hesitantly, "He did mention feeling odd after testing some new device last week, but the engineers assured him it was perfectly safe." Dorothy's eyebrows shot up. "A new device? What kind of device?" "Some sort of personal health monitor, I think. It's part of the new product line." Emily rubbed her temples. "God, I should have paid more attention." Dorothy patted her hand comfortingly. "It's not your fault, Miss Emily, but perhaps we should look into this device. It might give the doctors a clue about what they're dealing with." Emily nodded, a spark of hope in her eyes. "You're right. I'll make some calls, see if I can get more information." As Emily left to make her calls, Dorothy returned to her herb garden. She harvested fresh plants, her mind racing with possibilities. If Richard had indeed been exposed to some unknown toxin, perhaps her traditional remedies could help where modern medicine was struggling. Days passed, with Richard's condition steadily worsening. The doctors seemed at a loss, and the atmosphere at Hawthorne Manor grew increasingly tense. Emily split her time between the hospital and trying to keep her father's company running smoothly. One evening, as Dorothy was preparing another batch of herbal tea to take to the hospital, Emily burst into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement. "Dorothy, I think we've found something." She spread out several papers on the kitchen table. "Look at this. The new device Dad was testing. It uses a rare mineral in its sensor array. And get this, in its raw form, that mineral can be toxic." Dorothy leaned in, examining the technical specifications. "This could be it, Miss Emily. But if the doctors haven't identified it..." "They wouldn't know to look for it," Emily finished. "It's so rare. It's not on any standard toxicology panel." Dorothy nodded slowly. "If this is what's making your father ill, we need to find a way to counter its effects." Emily looked at her hopefully. "Your herbs?" "I'm not sure," Dorothy admitted. "This is beyond anything I've dealt with before, but..." She trailed off, lost in thought. "But what?" Emily pressed. Dorothy took a deep breath. "There's an old book, passed down in my family for generations. It contains remedies we've never shared outside the family. Some of them are for ailments I've never even heard of. It might have something that could help." Emily's eyes widened. "Where is this book?" "Hidden," Dorothy said. "I never thought I'd need to use it. Some of the remedies in there, they're powerful, Miss Emily. Potentially dangerous in the wrong hands." Emily grasped Dorothy's hands. "Dorothy, please. My father's life might depend on this." Dorothy looked into Emily's pleading eyes and made her decision. "All right, but we must be careful, and you must promise me that whatever we find stays between us." Emily nodded solemnly. "I promise." As they prepared to search for the hidden book, Marco entered the kitchen. He looked between them, sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on?" Emily and Dorothy exchanged a look. How much should they reveal? "Marco," Emily said slowly, "we might have found a way to help my father, But we need absolute discretion. Can we trust you?" Marco straightened, his usual bravado replaced by seriousness. "Of course. Mr. Hawthorne gave me a chance when no one else would. I'll do anything to help him." Dorothy nodded approvingly. "Good, because we're about to embark on something that could change everything. Are you ready?" Marco looked uncertain, but determined. "Ready for what?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper as she replied, "To challenge everything we thought we knew about medicine, technology, and the power of ancient wisdom." The kitchen fell silent as the weight of their mission settled upon them. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Dorothy's herb garden. In those fading rays of light, 3 unlikely allies prepared to delve into secrets long hidden, hoping to find a cure that modern science couldn't provide. Dorothy took a deep breath, her hand resting on the worn wood of the kitchen door. "Well then," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Let's begin." As they stepped out into the twilight, the scent of herbs filled the air, a reminder of the ancient knowledge they were about to unleash. Little did they know their quest to save Richard Hawthorne would uncover far more than they bargained for, shaking the foundations of his tech empire and challenging the very nature of progress itself. Emily turned to Dorothy, her face a mixture of hope and fear. "Do you really think we can save him?" Dorothy's reply was lost in the growing darkness as they made their way towards the hidden location of the ancient book. The answer to Emily's question, and the fate of Richard Hawthorne, lay in the pages of a tome that had survived generations, waiting for this very moment. Dorothy led Emily and Marco to a small shed at the far end of the garden. The structure looked unremarkable, weathered by years of exposure. Dorothy's hands shook slightly as she unlocked the door. "I haven't opened this in years," she muttered, more to herself than her companions. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and old wood. Dorothy moved with purpose, pushing aside gardening tools and empty pots. She knelt by an old trunk, its brass fittings dulled with age. "Here we are," she said, her voice hushed. Emily and Marco watched in silent anticipation as Dorothy opened the trunk. Inside, nestled among faded linens, was a book. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Dorothy lifted it reverently. "This has been in my family for generations. The knowledge in here. It's powerful, but dangerous in the wrong hands." Emily nodded solemnly. "We understand, Dorothy. We'll be careful." They returned to the kitchen, where Dorothy placed the book on the table. As she opened it, the spine crackled in protest. "Now," Dorothy said, her finger tracing the faded text, "we need to find something that can counteract the effects of this mineral." Hours passed as they pored over the ancient remedies. Marco, initially skeptical, found himself drawn into the wealth of knowledge contained in the fragile pages. "This is incredible," he murmured, reading about a cure for a disease he'd never heard of. "How is this not common knowledge?" Dorothy smiled sadly. "People forgot the old ways, dismissed them as superstition, but there's real power here if you know how to use it." Suddenly, Emily gasped. "Look at this!" She pointed to a page describing a tincture made from a combination of rare herbs. "It says it can draw out poisons that hide from the healer's eye." Could this be what we need? Dorothy read the passage carefully. It might be, but these ingredients, some of them I've never even seen. Marco leaned in. "I recognize this one. It's a rare herb from South America. I used it in a dish once trying to impress a food critic." He grinned sheepishly. It didn't work. Emily was already on her phone. "I can get these shipped overnight. Money's no object." As Emily made calls, Dorothy and Marco continued to study the book. The recipe was complex, requiring precise measurements and specific preparation methods. "This won't be easy," Dorothy warned. "One mistake, and it could be useless, or worse." Marco squared his shoulders. "Then we'll just have to not make any mistakes." The next day was a flurry of activity. Rare ingredients arrived from around the world. The kitchen was transformed into an alchemist's lab, with Dorothy directing Marco and Emily with the precision of a master chef. As they worked, Emily received updates from the hospital. Richard's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The doctors were considering experimental treatments, grasping at straws. "We're running out of time," Emily said, her voice tight with worry. Dorothy nodded grimly. "Then we'll just have to work faster." Hours ticked by, the kitchen filled with strange odors as herbs were ground, mixed, and distilled. Marco, used to creating culinary masterpieces, found himself in awe of Dorothy's skill. "You know," he said quietly, watching her measure out a precise amount of a glittering powder, "I think I misjudged you, Dorothy. This is true artistry." Dorothy smiled, not taking her eyes off her work. Cooking, healing, they're not so different. Both nourish the body and soul. As the sun began to set, Dorothy held up a small vial filled with a shimmering liquid. "It's done," she announced. Emily stared at it, hope and fear warring in her eyes. "Will it work?" Dorothy's expression was grave. "There's only one way to find out." They rushed to the hospital, the precious vial carefully tucked in Dorothy's bag. As they approached Richard's room, they were met by a team of grim-faced doctors. "Miss Hawthorne," one of them said, "I'm afraid your father's condition has worsened. We're considering putting him in a medically induced coma to slow the progression of the toxin." Emily's face paled. "Wait, we might have something that can help." The doctor looked skeptical as Emily explained about the tincture. "Miss Hawthorne, I understand you're desperate, but we can't administer an unknown substance to a patient." "Please," Emily begged. "You said yourself that nothing else is working. What do we have to lose?" After a heated discussion, the medical team reluctantly agreed to allow them to try the tincture, with the understanding that they would take full responsibility for any consequences. Dorothy approached Richard's bedside. The once powerful man looked small and frail, his skin ashen. With steady hands, she administered the tincture, whispering a prayer under her breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Richard's monitors began to beep erratically. "What's happening?" Emily cried. The doctors rushed forward, but Dorothy held up a hand. "Wait," she said, her eyes fixed on Richard's face. "Look." Slowly, color began to return to Richard's cheeks. His breathing, which had been shallow and labored, deepened and steadied. The medical team was astounded. They ran tests, confirming that the levels of the unknown toxin in Richard's system were dropping rapidly. Hours passed, and Richard's condition continued to improve. By morning, he was awake and alert, much to everyone's amazement. As Richard's eyes focused on Dorothy, standing quietly in the corner of the room, a look of recognition and then shame crossed his face. "Dorothy," he said, his voice weak but clear, "I owe you an apology, and my life, it seems." Dorothy stepped forward, a gentle smile on her face. "There's no need for apologies, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm just glad you're recovering." Richard shook his head. "No, there is. I've been a fool, dismissing the value of traditional knowledge. I thought only new technology could solve our problems, but it was the very thing that almost killed me." Emily, who had been hovering anxiously by her father's bedside, spoke up. "Dad, there's something you need to know about the new health monitor." As Emily explained about the toxic mineral, Richard's expression grew grave. "We need to stop production immediately," he said, "and launch a full investigation." Marco, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Mr. Hawthorne, if I may, perhaps this is an opportunity, not just to avoid a disaster, but to create something truly revolutionary." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "What if," Marco suggested, "we combine the cutting-edge technology of your company with the ancient wisdom Dorothy possesses? A fusion of old and new, creating health solutions that honor both innovation and tradition." Richard's eyes lit up with interest. He turned to Dorothy. "What do you think? Would you be willing to work with us on something like this?" Dorothy looked around the room, at the faces of Emily, Marco, and Richard, all watching her expectantly. She thought of her garden, of the book of ancient remedies, of the generations of knowledge she carried. "I think," she said slowly, "that would be a wonderful idea, but on one condition." "Name it," Richard said immediately. Dorothy's eyes twinkled. "I get to keep my herb garden and expand it." The room erupted in laughter, the tension of the past days finally breaking. As they began to discuss plans for this new venture, none of them realized that their actions had set in motion events that would ripple far beyond Hawthorne Manor. The fusion of ancient wisdom and modern technology was about to change the world in ways they couldn't imagine. Richard, still weak but determined, reached for Dorothy's hand. "I have a feeling," he said, "that this is the beginning of something extraordinary." Dorothy smiled, thinking of the generations before her who had safeguarded this knowledge. "Indeed it is, Mr. Hawthorne. Indeed it is." As the hospital room buzzed with excited conversation, Dorothy glanced out the window. The sun was rising, its golden rays touching the distant outline of her beloved herb garden. A new day was dawning, full of promise and possibilities. Emily caught her eye and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Dorothy nodded in acknowledgement, her heart full. She had started this journey as an undervalued cook and now stood at the precipice of a new adventure. Marco approached her, a look of admiration on his face. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "I think I have a lot to learn from you." Dorothy patted his arm. "And I from you, young man. That's the beauty of knowledge. It grows when shared." As the group continued to talk, Richard's voice cut through the chatter. "Dorothy," he called, his voice stronger now, "I have a question about that remedy of yours." Dorothy moved closer to Richard's bedside, ready to answer his question. "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne?" Richard's eyes were bright with curiosity, a stark contrast to his weakened state. "This remedy, could it be replicated, mass-produced?" Dorothy's expression turned serious. "It's not that simple, Mr. Hawthorne. Each batch requires precise preparation and some of the ingredients are quite rare." Emily chimed in, "Not to mention the knowledge required to prepare it correctly. It's not just about the ingredients, but how they're combined." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I see. So we can't just turn this into a pill and distribute it worldwide." "No," Dorothy agreed. "But that doesn't mean we can't use this knowledge to help people." Marco, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "What if we approached this differently? Instead of trying to mass-produce a single remedy, we could create a system that combines traditional knowledge with modern technology." The room fell silent as everyone considered this idea. Richard slowly sat up straighter in his hospital bed, his eyes gleaming with the spark of innovation. "Go on, Marco. What are you thinking?" Marco began to pace, his hands gesturing excitedly. "Imagine a device similar to the health monitor we were developing, but enhanced. It could detect imbalances in the body, cross-reference them with a database of traditional remedies, and suggest personalized treatments." Emily's eyes widened. "And we could include Dorothy's knowledge in that database?" Dorothy looked uncertain. "But how would we ensure the remedies are prepared correctly? It's not just about following a recipe." Richard snapped his fingers, wincing slightly at the effort. "Virtual reality? We could create VR tutorials, guided by Dorothy herself, teaching people how to prepare these remedies properly." The excitement in the room was palpable. Ideas were flying back and forth, each building on the last. Dorothy watched in amazement as her lifelong knowledge was being woven into a tapestry of modern innovation. "We could even create smart gardens," Emily suggested. "Automated systems that help people grow the herbs they need, with guidance on proper care and harvesting." Marco nodded enthusiastically. "And we could integrate this with local farming communities worldwide, support traditional farmers, preserve endangered plant species." As the discussion continued, Dorothy felt a mix of emotions washing over her. Pride at seeing her knowledge valued, excitement at the possibilities, but also a twinge of concern. "This all sounds wonderful," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "But we must be careful. This knowledge has been protected for generations for a reason. In the wrong hands, some of these remedies could be dangerous." The room fell silent, the weight of Dorothy's words sinking in. Richard reached out and took her hand. "You're absolutely right, Dorothy. We need to approach this with the utmost responsibility." He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each person in turn. This isn't just about making money or creating the next big tech product. This is about preserving wisdom, honoring traditions, and helping people in a way that respects both the past and the future. Emily nodded solemnly. We'll need to create strict ethical guidelines, ensure that this knowledge is used responsibly. And we'll need a team, Marco added. Experts in various fields, botanists, pharmacologists, tech developers, ethicists. As they continued to discuss the implications and potential of their idea, a nurse entered the room. "I'm sorry," she said, "but Mr. Hawthorne needs to rest now." Richard waved her off. "I'm fine. This is important." But Dorothy stood up, smoothing her apron. "The nurse is right, Mr. Hawthorne. You need to regain your strength. We can continue this discussion when you're better." Reluctantly, Richard agreed. As the others prepared to leave, he called out, "Dorothy, would you stay for a moment?" Once they were alone, Richard's expression turned serious. "Dorothy, I owe you more than just an apology. I've been blind to the value of what you bring to this household, to the world." Dorothy smiled gently. "We all have our blind spots, Mr. Hawthorne. What matters is that we learn from them." Richard nodded. "Indeed, and I have much to learn. Dorothy, I want you to be a full partner in this new venture. Your knowledge, your experience, they're the foundation of everything we're planning." Dorothy's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Hawthorne, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Richard urged. "We need you, Dorothy. I need you. Not just as a cook or a healer, but as a guide into this new frontier we're about to explore." Tears pricked at Dorothy's eyes. After years of feeling undervalued, to be recognized like this, it was overwhelming. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'd be honored." As Dorothy left the hospital room, her mind was reeling. In just a few days, her world had been turned upside down. She walked past Emily and Marco, who were still excitedly discussing ideas in the hallway. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, noticing Dorothy's emotional state. Dorothy nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, Miss Emily, everything is more than okay." As they made their way out of the hospital, Dorothy's thoughts turned to her herb garden. That small plot of land, so often dismissed as a waste of space, was about to become the seedbed of a revolution. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. As Richard recovered, plans for their new venture took shape. The Hawthorne Mansion became a hub of innovation, with experts from various fields coming and going. Dorothy found herself at the center of it all, her knowledge sought after and valued like never before. She spent hours in her garden, cataloging each plant, explaining its properties to eager botanists and developers. One afternoon, as she was demonstrating the proper way to harvest chamomile, she noticed Marco watching her intently. "You know," he said, "I used to think cooking was the highest form of art when it came to plants. But this is something else entirely." Dorothy smiled. "Cooking and healing aren't so different, Marco. Both require respect for your ingredients, understanding of how they interact, and a desire to nourish others." Marco nodded thoughtfully. "I'm beginning to see that. Could you teach me more about this?" "Of course," Dorothy replied, her heart warming at his genuine interest. "Why don't we start with something simple? Come, let me show you how to make a soothing tea for upset stomachs." As they walked through the garden, Dorothy felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. Her knowledge, passed down through generations, was not just being preserved. It was evolving, growing, finding new life in the modern world. Inside the mansion, Emily and Richard were in deep discussion with a team of developers. Holograms of plant molecules floated in the air as they debated the best way to integrate traditional knowledge with cutting-edge technology. "The key," Richard was saying, "is to create something that doesn't just replace traditional methods, but enhances them. We're not trying to make Dorothy's knowledge obsolete. We're trying to make it accessible to everyone." Emily nodded in agreement. "And we need to ensure that we're giving back to the communities where this knowledge originated. This can't be about exploitation." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Dorothy made her way back to the kitchen. She paused at the window, looking out at the herb garden that had been her sanctuary for so long. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a little girl learning at her grandmother's knee, to an undervalued cook, and now to a respected partner in a groundbreaking venture. The kitchen door opened, and Emily walked in. Dorothy, the team has some questions about the properties of that rare South American herb. Do you have a moment? Dorothy turned from the window, a smile on her face. Of course, Miss Emily. I always have time for herbs. As they walked back to the meeting room, Dorothy felt a surge of excitement. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities she had never imagined. Her life's work, once confined to a small garden, was about to change the world. But even as she embraced this new chapter, Dorothy knew she would never forget the simple truths that had guided her all along. Respect for nature, the power of knowledge passed down through generations, and the healing potential of a well-tended garden. Emily opened the door to the meeting room, where eager faces turned to greet them. Are you ready? She asked Dorothy. Dorothy took a deep breath, thinking of all the generations before her who had safeguarded this knowledge. Yes, she said, stepping forward. I'm ready. As the door closed behind them, the scent of herbs drifted in from the garden, a reminder of the ancient wisdom that was about to merge with the cutting edge of technology. A new era was beginning, and Dorothy was at its heart. As weeks turned into months, the project at Hawthorne Manor evolved into something far beyond what any of them had initially imagined. The sprawling estate had become a hub of innovation, with Dorothy's herb garden at its very center. One crisp autumn morning, Dorothy stood in her expanded garden, surrounded by a diverse team of researchers, developers, and traditionalists from around the world. The air was filled with a mix of languages and the gentle hum of advanced scanning devices. Now watch closely, Dorothy instructed, her weathered hands gently plucking a leaf from a plant with vibrant purple flowers. This herb, when prepared correctly, can help alleviate symptoms of anxiety, but timing is crucial. Harvest too early or too late, and its properties change dramatically. A young botanist from India leaned in, her eyes wide with wonder. It's remarkable how much the plant's chemical composition can vary based on such small factors. Dorothy nodded, a knowing smile on her face. Nature's rhythms are precise. Our ancestors knew this intuitively. Now, we have the technology to understand why. Nearby, Marco was leading a group of chefs and nutritionists, explaining how traditional medicinal herbs could be incorporated into modern cuisine. It's not just about flavor, he emphasized. It's about creating meals that nourish both body and soul. Inside the manor, Richard and Emily were in a virtual meeting with health organizations from across the globe. Holographic displays showed real-time data on how their integrated health system was being implemented in various communities. The results are exceeding our expectations, Richard announced, his voice strong and clear, a far cry from the weakened state he'd been in just months ago. By combining traditional knowledge with modern diagnostics, we're seeing health improvements in areas where conventional medicine alone has struggled. Emily added, and crucially, we're ensuring that the communities who've preserved this knowledge for generations are benefiting directly from its application. As the day progressed, Dorothy found herself in the state-of-the-art laboratory that had been built adjacent to her garden. Here, chemists and pharmacologists worked alongside practitioners of traditional medicine, bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern science. Dr. Amelia Chen, a leading pharmacologist, approached Dorothy with excitement. We've made a breakthrough, she said, gesturing to a complex molecular model floating in the air. That rare compound you identified in your family's book, we've managed to synthesize it without losing its efficacy. This could revolutionize treatment for several autoimmune disorders. Dorothy studied the model, a mix of pride and humility washing over her. My grandmother would have loved to see this, she mused. She always said our knowledge was meant to help all of humanity, not just our family. As evening approached, the team gathered in the manor's grand living room for their weekly review. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of purpose and camaraderie that transcended cultural and professional boundaries. Richard stood to address the group, his gaze sweeping across the diverse faces. When we started this journey, I thought we were creating a new product line. Instead, we've sparked a global movement. He turned to Dorothy, genuine respect in his eyes. And it all began in a garden that I once dismissed as outdated. Dorothy, you've taught us all that true innovation doesn't mean discarding the old, but building upon it wisely. Dorothy felt a lump in her throat. She thought of all the times she'd felt invisible in this very room, her knowledge undervalued. Now, she was at the heart of a project that was changing lives around the world. Emily chimed in, "We've made incredible progress, but there's still so much to learn. Every day we're discovering new connections between traditional practices and modern health challenges." Marco nodded enthusiastically. "And it's not just about medicine. The culinary world is being transformed too. Chefs around the world are rediscovering forgotten ingredients, creating dishes that are both delicious and healing." As the discussion continued, touching on everything from sustainable farming practices to the ethical implications of their work, Dorothy found herself marveling at the journey that had brought them here. Later that night, as the manor quieted, Dorothy took a solitary walk through her garden. The moon cast a silvery glow over the plants, many of which had been in her family for generations. She paused by a patch of chamomile, remembering how her grandmother had taught her to make tea from its flowers. "If only you could see this, Grandma," she whispered to the night air. "Your knowledge is changing the world." A soft footstep behind her made Dorothy turn. It was Emily, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. "I thought I might find you here," Emily said, coming to stand beside her. "Sometimes I think you can hear the plants talking." Dorothy chuckled. "In a way, I can. Each one has a story, a purpose. I'm just glad those stories are finally being heard." Emily linked her arm through Dorothy's. "You know, when I was a little girl, I used to watch you in this garden. I thought you were some kind of magician, the way you could make things grow and heal people. I never understood why my father couldn't see how special your knowledge was." "People often overlook what's right in front of them," Dorothy replied gently. "But your father sees it now. We all do." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds of the garden. "Dorothy," Emily said hesitantly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you. With all the success we're having, there's been talk of taking the company public. It would mean rapid expansion, reaching even more people." Dorothy held up a hand, stopping her. "Miss Emily, I trust you and your father to make the right decisions for the business side of things. My concern is and always will be the plants and the knowledge they represent." Emily nodded, relief evident on her face. "I was hoping you'd say that. We want to set up a foundation to ensure that no matter what happens with the company, the core of what we're doing, preserving and sharing traditional knowledge, will be protected." Dorothy smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness. "That sounds wonderful. And perhaps we could use some of the foundation's resources to support young people who want to learn the old ways." "Absolutely," Emily agreed enthusiastically. "In fact, we've already had inquiries from universities about setting up scholarship programs." As they made their way back to the house, Dorothy felt a sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead was not without challenges, balancing tradition with innovation, ensuring ethical practices, navigating the complexities of global healthcare. But she was confident in the team they had built. The next morning, as dawn broke over Hawthorne Manor, Dorothy was already in her garden, tending to her beloved plants. She heard the familiar sound of Marco's footsteps approaching. "Good morning, Dorothy," he called cheerfully. "Ready for another day of changing the world?" Dorothy straightened up, brushing soil from her hands. She looked around at the garden that had once been her quiet refuge and was now the beating heart of a global initiative. She thought of the countless lives being touched by the knowledge she had carried for so long. "You know, Marco," she said with a smile, "I think I've been ready for this my whole life." As they walked together towards the house where the day's work awaited them, Dorothy felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her journey had been long and often difficult, but it had led her to this moment where ancient wisdom and modern innovation were coming together to create a healthier, more balanced world. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the herb garden, promising another day of discovery and healing. And at the center of it all stood Dorothy, once an undervalued cook, now a respected healer and innovator, ready to share her knowledge with the world. As they reached the door, Dorothy paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the bustling manor researchers arriving, computers humming to life, the air filled with the scent of herbs and possibility. "Well," she said, her eyes twinkling, Shall we begin?" And with that, Dorothy stepped into the house, ready to bridge the gap between past and future, one herb at a time. The world was changing, and she was helping to guide that change, ensuring that the wisdom of the ages would continue to heal and nourish for generations to come.